A 68-year-old widow storms into a billionaire's office pretending to be her desperate granddaughter. Everyone expected security to throw her out. But when she spoke those words, the ruthless CEO collapsed in tears. Rita Morrison gripped the manila envelope containing her granddaughter's resume so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. At 68 years old, she had never set foot in a building like this. All glass and steel, with doors that whispered open on their own, and a lobby that smelled of money she'd never had. The scent of expensive air freshener mixed with premium coffee made her head spin. Or maybe that was just her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. "I have to do this for her," she whispered to herself, smoothing down the beige dress she'd ironed 4 times that morning. It wasn't designer, would never be, but it was clean, pressed with care, and carried the dignity of a woman who'd learned to hold her head high, even when life kept trying to knock her down. Everything had started 36 hours ago. Rita woke to the sound of something crashing in the bathroom, followed by a cry that made her blood run cold. She found Sophie, her 24-year-old granddaughter, crumpled on the tile floor, clutching her ankle. "Grandma, I slipped," Sophie gasped, fighting back tears that were already streaming down her face. "The interview is tomorrow morning. I've been preparing for months." Rita helped Sophie to the couch, wrapped ice around the swelling ankle, and held her granddaughter while she sobbed. It was a position at Walker Industries, run by James Walker, a 35-year-old CEO with a reputation for brilliance, impossibly high standards, and zero tolerance for excuses. 3 months unemployed, Grandma. 3 months of rejection letters and dead-end interviews. This was my shot. Sophie's voice cracked on the last word. "James Walker doesn't reschedule. Miss your interview, you're out. No exceptions, no second chances." While Sophie finally drifted off under the haze of pain medication, Rita sat in the darkness of the living room, her mind racing. She thought about all the doors that had been slammed in her own face when she was young. About the nights she'd watched Sophie hunched over her laptop, teaching herself coding, rebuilding her portfolio for the 100th time, practicing answers to questions until her voice went hoarse. That's when the idea crept in. Insane, impossible, dangerous. But Rita had survived worse. What was facing down a billionaire CEO compared to raising 3 kids alone after her husband walked out? What was this compared to working 3 jobs on 4 hours of sleep just to keep food on the table? Now, standing in the reception area on the 28th floor, Rita felt the full weight of that decision pressing down on her shoulders. The receptionist, a young woman with makeup so perfect it looked airbrushed, was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and barely concealed contempt. "You said you have an interview with Mr. Walker?" "Yes, 9 o'clock, for the senior analyst position." The receptionist's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together as she typed something into her computer. "But the appointment is under Sophie Morrison's name." "That's me," Rita said, lifting her chin slightly. "You're Sophie Morrison? I'm here at the scheduled time, with all the required documentation." Rita kept her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking inside her coat pockets. "Is Mr. Walker available?" The receptionist picked up the phone, speaking in hushed tones while shooting glances at Rita like she was trying to confirm that this was actually happening. "You can have a seat. He'll see you in a few minutes." Rita lowered herself into a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Around her, young professionals tapped away on sleek laptops, discussing metrics and KPIs and synergy. They all looked like they'd been born for this world, like the air up here was their natural habitat. Rita felt like an intruder who'd wandered into the wrong story. She closed her eyes, and the memories came flooding back. She'd been 20 when she got pregnant with Camilla, Sophie's mother. Her husband Marcus promised he'd take care of everything, that she could focus on the babies, that they'd be fine. 3 kids later, when Rita was 28 years old, Marcus left a note on the kitchen table that said he couldn't handle the pressure anymore, and disappeared. Rita had to find herself fast, cleaning houses during the day, ironing clothes at night, baking and selling cakes on weekends. Waking up at 4 in the morning, collapsing into bed after midnight, giving up everything, sleep, dreams, any life of her own, so her daughters could have education and opportunities she'd never had. It worked. Camilla became a nurse. Her other daughters built decent lives, and Sophie was so close to landing her dream job. Rita wouldn't let a twisted ankle destroy that. Ms. Morrison? The receptionist's voice cut through her thoughts. Mr. Walker will see you now. Last door on the right. Rita stood, feeling every one of her 68 years in her knees and back. She walked down the corridor with as much dignity as she could gather. Each footstep echoed on the polished marble, marking the rhythm of her racing pulse. She knocked softly on the half-open door. "Come in," a man's voice answered. The office looked like something from a magazine spread. Floor-to-ceiling windows, panoramic city views, furniture so modern it barely looked functional. Behind a desk of glass and chrome sat James Walker, younger than his photos suggested. Dark hair perfectly styled, charcoal suit, eyes that seemed to take in everything and calculate its worth in seconds. When he looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifted from neutral to confused in an instant. "I'm sorry. There must be some mistake. I was expecting Sophie Morrison, candidate for the senior analyst position." "That's me," Rita said quietly, closing the door behind her. James blinked, his brain visibly trying to process impossible information. "You're Sophie Morrison? The 24-year-old candidate with a master's degree in business management?" "May I sit down?" "Yes, but I need to understand what's happening here." Rita sat, folding her hands in her lap with practiced grace, and met his eyes directly. "Mr. Walker, I know this isn't conventional, and I know you value honesty above almost everything else. So I'll be direct. I'm here in place of my granddaughter because she had an accident yesterday and couldn't make it." The silence stretched thin between them. Rita could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "You're telling me," James began slowly, his voice a careful blend of disbelief and controlled anger, "that you thought it was appropriate to come to a corporate interview pretending to be your granddaughter? I know how it sounds, but please let me explain." "Oh, I definitely want to hear this." James leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, defensive but curious. He hadn't thrown her out yet. That had to mean something. Rita took a deep breath. Sophie prepared for weeks. She studied every project Walker Industries has done, rebuilt her portfolio 3 times, practiced her answers until she could recite them in her sleep. Yesterday evening, hours before this interview, she slipped in the bathroom and twisted her ankle badly. When she tried to stand, she passed out from the pain. "That's unfortunate," James said, his tone softening slightly. "But it doesn't justify this substitution. You don't accept rescheduling requests." "That's true. And you give each candidate exactly 1 chance." "Also true. Then Sophie's only shot would have been lost because of an accident completely beyond her control." Rita kept her gaze steady. "I couldn't let that happen." James leaned forward, studying her face. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Rita. Rita Morrison." "Mrs. Morrison, with all due respect, what exactly did you think you'd accomplish? Even if I admire your courage, and I do, you're not the candidate. You don't have the qualifications, the experience in the field." "That's absolutely right," Rita agreed. "I don't have a master's degree. I don't know agile methodologies or data analytics. I've never worked in corporate management." "Then why come?" Rita opened her purse and pulled out a folder. "Because I brought Sophie's real portfolio. Her certifications, her projects, letters of recommendation. Everything you'd need to evaluate her actual qualifications." James took the folder, but his eyes stayed on Rita. "I still don't understand. You could have called, asked for an exception. Would you have granted one?" Pause. "Probably not. I came here in person to show you that Sophie comes from a family that doesn't give up. When doors close, we find windows. When obstacles appear, we find ways around them." James flipped through the portfolio, but his mind was clearly working on something bigger, trying to decide how to respond to something that had never happened in any protocol he'd ever followed. "Mrs. Morrison, I'll be honest, this is completely irregular. I'm torn between admiring your audacity and being offended by the presumption." "It wasn't meant as disrespect," Rita said calmly. "It was the desperation of a grandmother who watched her granddaughter cry all night over an opportunity lost to bad luck." Something shifted in his face. Subtle, but Rita saw it. A crack in the professional armor. "How old are you, Mrs. Morrison?" 68. "Have you worked your whole life?" "Since I was 15. Started helping my mother clean houses. Then I cleaned, ironed, cooked, sewed, whatever work I could find. And now? Retired. I live with Sophie, help with expenses. She's been unemployed for 3 months. James set the portfolio on his desk. The silence felt like it lasted forever. You know what's ironic, Mrs. Morrison? My grandmother was also named Rita, and she would have done exactly what you did today. His expression had transformed completely, the irritation giving way to something softer, more human. She raised my mother alone after my grandfather died in a construction accident. Worked as a housekeeper for 30 years. Never went to school herself but made sure my mother did, and my mother made sure I did. Rita felt tears threatening to form. Then you understand. I understand more than you know. James walked to the window, looking out at the city below. But understanding doesn't solve my problem. I need to hire someone qualified. And as much as I appreciate what you've done, I can't base a hiring decision on emotion. Rita stood up. I'm not asking you to hire based on emotion. I'm asking you to look at Sophie's portfolio and judge her on her own merits. Give her the chance to come in person, tomorrow, next week, whenever she can walk again. Just don't eliminate her because of an accident. James turned to face her. For a long moment, he searched her face for something. Do you realize you could have destroyed her chances by coming here? Many CEOs would have had security escort you out immediately. I know that, Rita said. But I also know you're not like most people. I read about you, how you started with nothing, how you value not just competence but character. I gambled that a man who honors his grandmother Rita's memory might understand another grandmother Rita, trying to help her granddaughter. A slight smile touched James's lips. You did your homework. Sophie did her homework. I just paid attention when she talked about this interview every night for weeks. James returned to his chair, this time actually studying each page of the portfolio carefully. Rita remained standing, unsure whether she should sit back down or wait in silence. Finally, he looked up. Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to do something I've never done before. Something I'll probably regret. Rita's heart jumped into her throat. What? I'm going to give Sophie the interview she deserves, but with one condition. Anything. You come back with her. I want to meet the young woman who has a grandmother brave enough to walk into a CEO's office to fight for her chances. The tears Rita had been holding back finally spilled over. Thank you, Mr. Walker. You won't regret this. I'm not entirely sure about that yet, James replied, but there was genuine warmth in his voice now. My assistant will schedule a new time, and Mrs. Morrison, yes? My grandmother Rita would have been proud to meet you. When Rita walked out of that office, her legs trembling and her heart still racing, she knew something bigger had happened. This wasn't just about a rescheduled interview. It was about two different worlds colliding and recognizing something essential, the dignity of people who fight for those they love. Waiting for the elevator, Rita thought that maybe there were still powerful people who remembered where they came from, people who still had hearts underneath the expensive suits. 1 week later, Rita stood once again in the lobby of Walker Industries, but this time she wasn't alone. Sophie limped beside her, still favoring her left ankle, leaning on a discreet cane. The bruising had faded to a yellowish green, barely visible under dark stockings, but the slight hesitation in each step told the real story. Grandma, I still can't believe you actually did that, Sophie whispered as they waited for the elevator. Her voice carried equal parts admiration and pure terror. You walked into his office and just told him the truth. Rita adjusted the collar of her granddaughter's blazer with practiced tenderness. Sometimes the truth is the only weapon we have, sweetheart. And it worked, didn't it? It worked because he has a heart, Sophie replied, gripping her portfolio tighter. But what if he changes his mind when he meets me? What if I'm not good enough? What if… Sophie. Rita cupped her granddaughter's face with both hands, forcing eye contact. You are brilliant. You are capable. You've prepared more than anyone else would have. Now take a breath and show him why this second chance was worth giving. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Inside, Sophie squeezed her grandmother's hand so hard it hurt. Rita squeezed back, channeling every ounce of confidence she had into that grip. When the doors opened on the 28th floor, the same receptionist from the previous week greeted them. This time, though, her expression held no contempt. Instead, there was genuine curiosity and perhaps a hint of respect. Mrs. Morrison, the young woman said with a polite smile, and you must be Sophie. Mr. Walker is expecting you both. You can go straight in. Sophie swallowed hard, glancing at Rita, who simply nodded encouragingly. The walk down that corridor felt endless. Sophie counted each step, trying to control her breathing like she'd practiced. She'd rehearsed her answers hundreds of times, reviewed every project in her portfolio, until she could recite them from memory. But nothing had prepared her for the nervousness of meeting the man her grandmother had confronted on her behalf. James was standing when they entered, which caught Sophie off guard. Most executives she'd interviewed with remained seated, establishing an immediate power hierarchy. But James walked toward them, extending his hand to Rita first. "Mrs. Morrison, good to see you again. And you must be Sophie." He turned to the young woman, and Sophie noticed his eyes were remarkably penetrating, like they could read thoughts. "How's your ankle?" "Better, Mr. Walker. Thank you for asking. And thank you for this opportunity." Sophie shook his hand, trying to project confidence despite her nerves threatening to strangle her voice. "Please, both of you, sit." James gestured to 2 chairs facing his desk. "Sophie, before we begin formally, I need to say something. What your grandmother did was completely irregular, technically inappropriate, and broke every protocol I have for hiring processes." Sophie's heart plummeted. Rita tensed beside her. "But," James continued, and there was a glint in his eyes, "it was also one of the most courageous and honest things I've witnessed in my years as CEO. So let's put that aside and focus on what matters. Do you have the qualifications I need for this position?" Sophie breathed in, and something inside her shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it transformed into determination. If her 68-year-old grandmother had the courage to walk into this office, she had the courage to show her worth. "I do, Mr. Walker, and I can prove it." For the next hour, Sophie presented her portfolio with growing confidence. She explained projects she'd developed in graduate school, methodologies she'd mastered, management tools she knew inside and out. James asked pointed questions, technical, challenging, designed to probe the depth of her knowledge. Rita remained silent throughout, but her presence was an invisible anchor keeping Sophie steady. "Impressive," James finally said, leaning back in his chair. "Especially your process optimization project. The results you achieved were significant." "Thank you, sir. I believe efficiency isn't just about numbers. It's about understanding the people involved in the process." Sophie took a risk, letting some of her philosophy show through. James looked intrigued. "Explain." "Well, in the project I presented, I could have simply redesigned the workflows based purely on data, but I spent time talking with the people who actually performed the tasks. I understood their frustrations, their insights, their ideas. The final solution was more human-centered, and consequently, more effective." Something changed in James's expression. Rita saw it, even though Sophie was too focused on her answer to notice. It was recognition, resonance. "Sophie, you're hired." The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. What?" Sophie blinked, certain she'd misheard. "You have the technical qualifications I need. But more importantly, you understand something many professionals take years to learn, that business is done by people, not spreadsheets." James stood, extending his hand again. "Welcome to Walker Industries. My assistant will send the contract details by this afternoon." Sophie stood shakily, and it wasn't because of her ankle. She shook his hand, then turned and hugged Rita tightly, tears streaming silently down her face. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered. "Thank you for believing in me." Rita stroked her granddaughter's hair, her own eyes wet. "I always believed, my love. Always." "Sophie," James interrupted gently, "would you mind giving me a moment to speak with your grandmother privately? There's something I'd like to discuss." Sophie looked between them, confused but trusting. "Of course. I'll wait in the reception area." She left, still floating in the euphoria of landing the job. When the door closed, James gestured for Rita to sit again. He walked to the window, standing in silence for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. "Mrs. Morrison, may I ask you a very direct question?" "I've always preferred honesty, Mr. Walker." He turned, and Rita saw something vulnerable in his face. "How do you do it?" "Do what, sir?" "Connect with people like that. I watched Sophie talk about understanding people in processes. I watched you walk in here last week and, in 20 minutes, get me to break rules I've maintained for years. How do you both do it?" Rita studied the young man in front of her. Wealthy, powerful, successful. and completely lost in something fundamental. May I be frank? Please. You've built an empire, Mr. Walker, but in the process, you've forgotten how to talk with the people who build that empire alongside you. You're so focused on strategies and metrics that you've lost touch with the heart of your company. James didn't look offended. He looked relieved that someone had finally said it out loud. My team respects me, he said, but it sounded like a question. Respect and connection are different things. People can respect you and still feel like you don't truly see them. How do I change that? Rita stood, walking to join him at the window. Below, the city teemed with millions of lives, each with their own stories, struggles, dreams. Start by remembering that every person working for you has a story like your grandmother Rita's. Each one has battles you'll never see, victories you'll never celebrate, fears you'll never know, unless you ask. Asking seems too simple. The most powerful things usually are. When was the last time you asked someone on your team how they're doing and actually waited for the real answer? James fell silent, and that silence was answer enough. When my grandmother was alive, he began slowly, she always knew when something was bothering me. Even if I said I was fine, she'd look in my eyes and just know. Then she'd sit with me, make tea, and wait until I was ready to talk. She saw you, Rita said softly. Not the CEO in training, not the grandson with potential. Just you, the person. My employees are incredibly talented, James continued. But recently I've realized there's a distance. They do the work, deliver results, but something's missing. Genuine enthusiasm, initiative beyond what's required, loyalty that goes deeper than a paycheck. Because loyalty can't be bought, Mr. Walker. It's built through small moments where people feel seen, heard, valued beyond their productive output. James looked at Rita with new intensity. Have you ever thought about working as a consultant? Rita laughed, genuinely surprised. Sir, I'm just a retired grandmother. You're much more than that. You're someone who understands people in ways that I, with all my degrees and experience, am still trying to learn. He paused. Let me make you an unusual proposal. I'm listening. I'd like you to come here once or twice a week. Not to work formally. Just to observe, talk with the team, and then give me your honest perspective on what you see. A kind of humanity consultant. Rita blinked, processing. You're serious? Completely. I'll pay you for your time, obviously. But more importantly, I think your presence here could help me reconnect with something I lost along the way. And what would that be? The ability to see people as people, not as resources. Rita thought about Sophie starting her career. Thought about bills that always stretched tight at the end of each month. Thought also about the young man in front of her. So successful yet so starved for something she'd always had in abundance. The capacity to connect humanly. I accept, she said finally. But with one condition. What's that? That you're genuinely willing to listen, even when I tell you things you don't want to hear. Even when I question your decisions. Even when I point out that you're wrong. James smiled, and it was the first truly relaxed smile Rita had seen on him. Mrs. Morrison, someone who has the courage to walk into a CEO's office to defend her granddaughter will definitely have the courage to tell me when I'm being an idiot. Then we have an agreement. They shook hands, and Rita felt she was embarking on something much larger than simply a consulting job. She was embarking on a mission to reconnect a brilliant man with his own humanity, and perhaps, in the process, help many other people feel seen in their workplaces. When Rita left the office and found Sophie in the reception area, her granddaughter jumped up immediately. What did he want? He offered me a job. Sophie froze. What? Looks like your grandmother got hired today, too. Rita smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of amusement and determination. We're going to change some things around here, Sophie. Together. And for the first time in a long while, Rita felt her life was about to have a new purpose. A purpose that went beyond just surviving or supporting from the sidelines. She was going to make a real difference. 3 weeks after that conversation, Rita sat in a strategic corner of Walker Industries' open office, observing. James had insisted she didn't need to do anything beyond that. Observe, talk, feel the environment. It seemed too simple to be called work, but Rita was already noticing there was far more happening here than meetings and computer screens. The space was modern, flooded with natural light, with shared desks and break areas featuring colorful beanbags, On paper, it looked like the ideal workplace. In practice, Rita saw something completely different. She saw people typing frantically, but with shoulders hunched in tension. She saw conversations happening in hushed whispers, almost like speaking itself was an unwanted interruption. She saw polite smiles that never reached people's eyes. She saw, primarily, an absence of lightness, of genuine camaraderie, of joy. Sophie sat a few desks ahead, focused on her computer screen. She was adapting well technically, but Rita noticed her granddaughter had already absorbed the ambient tension. Her shoulders, once relaxed, now remained slightly elevated throughout the entire workday. "Coffee, Mrs. Morrison." A soft voice pulled her from her observations. It was Juliana, a 28-year-old administrative assistant who always stopped to greet her. "I'd love some, dear, but only if you sit with me for a minute." Juliana hesitated, glancing around as if seeking invisible permission. "I don't know if I can. I have so much work." "Just 1 minute," Rita insisted gently, indicating the chair beside her. The young woman perched on the edge of the seat, her body language screaming urgency and discomfort. Rita picked up her coffee cup and took a slow sip, deliberately creating a pause. "Juliana, may I ask you something? How long have you worked here?" 2.5 years. "And do you like what you do?" The question seemed to catch Juliana off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, thought. Yes. I mean, it's a good job. Decent salary, good benefits." "I didn't ask about salary or benefits," Rita said softly. "I asked if you like what you do." Juliana lowered her gaze to her own hands. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. When I started here, I was so excited. I had ideas, wanted to contribute, wanted to grow. But now, I just complete tasks. Do what I'm asked. Avoid mistakes. Go home." "Why did it change?" "Because I learned that having ideas here is dangerous. Last time I suggested something different in a meeting, my supervisor looked at me like I'd said the stupidest thing in the world. He didn't say anything, just looked. But that look was enough. I never raised my hand again." Rita felt her chest tighten. How many brilliant ideas were dying in this office simply because people were afraid to speak? "What if I told you your opinion matters, that your ideas have value?" Juliana smiled, but it was a sad smile. "With all respect, Mrs. Morrison, you're kind, but that doesn't change the culture here." After Juliana returned to work, Rita continued observing with even sharper eyes. She saw patterns. A young developer who had a question, but spent 15 minutes gathering courage to ask the colleague beside him. A designer who redid the same work 3 times, clearly insecure about what was expected of her. A manager who only spoke to his team to give orders, never to listen. At day's end, James called her to his office. "So, Mrs. Morrison, first impressions?" Rita didn't believe in beating around the bush. "Your people are afraid." James frowned. "Afraid? Afraid of what?" "Of making mistakes, of speaking, of being human." Rita sat without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Walker, you've built an efficient company, but efficiency without humanity creates robots, not people. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Is it? Then tell me, when was the last time someone on your team openly disagreed with you in a meeting?" James opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Thought. They know they can disagree. Knowing they can and feeling they can are different things. Juliana told me she stopped giving ideas because a supervisor made her feel stupid. How many other Julianas exist here? Juliana never told me that. Because she's afraid of being seen as a problem, because she learned it's safer to be invisible than to be authentic. James stood, walking to the window, his favorite spot when he needed to process uncomfortable information. "I didn't want to create an environment like this. I know you didn't. But intention and impact are different. You're brilliant at strategy, at analysis, at results, but you forgot that results are created by people, and people need to feel safe to give their best. How do I change it? It starts with you. Leaders define culture by what they do, not what they say." Rita stood, walking to stand beside him. "Tomorrow, I want you to do something different." "What?" "Call a meeting with the entire team. Not to give orders or present numbers. To listen. Ask what's working and what isn't. Ask how people feel. And when they speak, don't interrupt. Don't justify. Don't defend. Just listen." James looked skeptical. "What if they don't say anything?" What if they stay silent because they don't trust? Then you'll have your answer about the size of the problem. But my intuition says that if you create safe space, people will speak. Because deep down, everyone wants to be heard. The next morning, James sent an email calling a general meeting. Rita watched the reaction in the office, exchanged glances, nervous whispers. Sophie came to her, worried. "Grandma, people are scared. They think there's going to be mass layoffs or drastic changes." "That's because they're not used to transparency," Rita responded. "But everything will be fine." At 3 in the afternoon, the entire team gathered in the main conference room. 43 people squeezed in, most standing or sitting on the floor. James stood at the front, visibly uncomfortable. Rita positioned herself strategically in the back, observing. "Thank you for coming," James began, and his voice had a vulnerability the team clearly wasn't accustomed to hearing. "I called you here because I realized something. I realized I might be so focused on results that I forgot to ask how you're doing. So today, I'm not going to talk about projects or goals. Today, I want to hear from you." Absolute silence. People staring at their own feet. "I'm going to ask a simple question," James continued. "What's working well here, and what needs to change?" More silence. 30 seconds that felt like eternity. Then Juliana, to everyone's surprise, timidly raised her hand. "Can I speak?" "Please," James said, and Rita saw genuine relief on his face. "What works? We have challenging projects, cutting-edge technology, fair salaries. What doesn't work?" Juliana took a deep breath. "What doesn't work is that I'm afraid to give ideas, that I work in fear of making mistakes, that I never know if I'm doing a good job because nobody says anything unless it's criticism." It was like Juliana had broken open a dam. Other hands began to rise. "I agree," said Marcus, a senior developer. "I love the technical work, but I feel like we're treated as machines, not people. Nobody knows my daughter was born last month because I'm afraid of seeming less dedicated if I talk about personal life. I work 12 hours a day," spoke Carla, a designer. "Not because it's necessary, but because I'm afraid of being seen as lazy if I leave on time. I've had anxiety attacks because of it. When I made a coding error last month," confessed Ricardo, a junior developer, "I spent 3 days without sleep trying to fix it alone because I was terrified of admitting it. The problem was simple. I could have asked for help, but I preferred to suffer alone rather than seem incompetent." "I thought about quitting last week," said Patricia, a project manager, her voice breaking. "Not because I don't like the work, but because I feel empty. I feel like I'm just a task executor, not a person with value." The room was completely silent now, except for the brave voices sharing painful truths. James remained standing, listening to every word, without interrupting, exactly as Rita had instructed. She saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. When finally no one had anything left to say, James took a deep breath. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with your truths. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for creating an environment where you feel fear instead of safety, where you feel you need to hide your humanity to be professional." He paused, discreetly wiping his eyes. "I can't promise I'll change everything overnight. But I promise that starting today, things will be different. I promise I'll value you as people, not just as employees. I promise that making mistakes will be seen as part of learning, not as failure. And I promise I'll work every day to deserve the trust you've shown today." Someone started applauding. Slowly, others joined in. It wasn't polite corporate meeting applause. It was applause of relief, of hope, of something finally changing. As people began to leave, many stopped to shake James's hand or simply look him in the eyes in a new way. Rita saw Sophie hugging co-workers, tears streaming. She saw Juliana genuinely smiling for the first time. She saw an office that, for the first time in a long while, seemed to breathe. James walked to Rita, emotionally exhausted. "I had no idea. I simply had no idea how much I was hurting people." "Now you know," Rita said gently. "And knowing is the first step to fixing it. How do I fix years of wrong culture? One day at a time, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time." Rita placed her hand on his arm. "The most important thing is that today, for the first time, they saw that you care, that you're willing to listen, that you acknowledge mistakes. That's worth more than 1,000 pretty corporate policies." That night, when Rita got home, she found a message from Juliana. Thank you for encouraging me to speak. For the first time in 2 years, I have hope that I can love my job again." Rita smiled, putting away her phone. This was only the beginning. 2 months after that transformative meeting, Walker Industries was unrecognizable. The office that once breathed tension now had laughter echoing through the corridors. People ate lunch together, exchanged ideas freely, and most surprising, the numbers were better than ever. James had implemented profound changes. Meetings started with 5 minutes for people to share something personal. Mistakes were discussed openly as learning opportunities. He instituted open door hours, where any employee could walk into his office without prior appointment. And most importantly, he was present, truly present. Rita was at her usual spot in the office when Juliana came running in, holding a tablet with a radiant face. "Mrs. Morrison, my idea was approved. The feedback system I suggested is going to be implemented company-wide." "I knew that would happen, dear." Rita hugged the young woman, feeling her heart race with genuine happiness. "Your voice always had value. It just needed someone to stop and listen." Sophie approached, also smiling. In the past 2 months, her granddaughter had flourished in ways Rita never imagined possible. She was leading an important project, mentoring newer employees, and had a lightness in her eyes that hadn't existed before. "Grandma, my team's productivity increased 40% since we started implementing the changes." 40%. And people are getting home on time, not working until dawn. "Because happy people work better," Rita replied simply. "It's always been that way. They just needed to rediscover it." But not everything was roses. Rita had noticed James becoming increasingly tense in recent weeks. He smiled with the team, participated in conversations, but when he thought no one was watching, his brow furrowed with worry. That afternoon, she discovered why. James called her to his office urgently. When she entered, she found 3 other men in expensive suits. One of them, with graying hair and authoritative posture, looked at her with barely disguised disdain. "Mrs. Morrison," James made introductions with a tense voice. "These are members of the Investor Board. Robert Mitchell, Chairman, Carlos Brennan, and David Hughes." "Pleasure," Rita greeted, immediately perceiving it wasn't reciprocated. "James told us about your informal consultancy here," Robert began, his tone suggesting he found the idea ridiculous. "So we wanted to meet the person responsible for the recent changes." "Responsible would be an exaggeration," Rita replied calmly. "I simply help Mr. Walker see his team with more clarity. That's exactly what we need to discuss." Robert opened a thick folder. "James, the numbers from last quarter deeply concern the board." James frowned. "The numbers are better than the previous quarter. Productivity increased, yes, but operational costs also increased significantly. You're spending on environment improvements, wellness programs, non-essential training. This is reducing our profits." "By 3%, James responded. "Profits reduced by 3%, but productivity jumped 25%. Long term, this will generate much higher returns." "Long term is speculation," Carlos intervened. "Investors don't work with speculation. They work with concrete numbers. And concretely, you're spending money that could be going to dividends." Rita remained silent, but observed every nuance of the conversation. She saw James defending himself, but also saw doubt beginning to infiltrate his confidence. "Besides," David added, "there are reports that you're being too soft with the team, that people are getting comfortable, that you're losing your competitive edge." "Reports from whom?" James asked, his voice sharp. "That doesn't matter. What matters is the board is questioning your direction. Some investors want a leadership change if things don't return to the previous standard." The silence in the room was heavy. Rita saw James's face pale. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was being threatened. "Gentlemen," Rita finally spoke, and everyone turned to her surprised, as if they'd forgotten she was there. "May I ask a very direct question?" "Excuse me, but this is corporate business," Robert said condescendingly. "And precisely because of that, my external perspective might be valuable." Rita didn't flinch. "When was the last time you actually talked with the employees of this company? Not with managers in formal meetings, but with the people who actually make the work happen?" "I don't see how that's relevant," Carlos replied. "It's completely relevant, because you're worried about dividends and short-term numbers, but you're ignoring that this company was bleeding good people. Turnover before the changes was 30% annually. Do you know how much it costs to replace a qualified employee? Do you know how much knowledge and productivity is lost every time someone leaves? Robert stared at her. Mom, with all respect, you don't understand business. You're right. I don't have an MBA. I've never created a financial spreadsheet. But I understand people. And I can guarantee that a company full of unhappy, scared, and demotivated people might generate profits short term, but eventually it collapses. That's theory, sentimentalism, David shot back. Is it? Rita stood, walking to the window. Then explain to me why, before the changes, you had 3 important projects behind schedule, 5 lawsuits from disgruntled employees, and rumors that your best talent was looking for jobs at competitor companies. All of that disappeared. But apparently, 3% reduction in profits is more concerning than the company being about to implode from the inside out. James looked at Rita with something between admiration and desperation. The investors seemed irritated at being challenged by a 68-year-old woman. James, Robert ignored Rita completely. You have 2 choices. Either you reverse these humanitarian changes and refocus on what really matters, financial results, or the board will be forced to consider other leadership options. You have until the next quarterly meeting, 3 months. When the investors left, the silence in the office was suffocating. James sank into his chair, running his hands over his face. They're going to remove me from the company I built, he said, his voice broken. They're going to remove me because I chose to treat people like human beings. Rita sat in the chair across from him. And are you going to let them? I don't know if I have a choice. If I reverse the changes, I go back to being the CEO who makes people miserable. If I maintain the changes, I lose everything. You have a choice. You always do. The question is, what legacy do you want to leave? James lifted his eyes, and Rita saw tears threatening to fall. My grandmother Rita raised me to be good, to care for people, to use what I have to help others. But the business world seems to punish that. It seems like being good and being successful are mutually exclusive. Rita took a deep breath. It was time to share something she rarely talked about. When my husband abandoned me with 3 young daughters, I had to work in 3 places to survive. One of them was a sewing factory. The owner, Mr. Albert, was wealthy, had imported cars, a huge house, but he treated the employees like garbage. James was listening intently now. We earned a pittance. No rights, no protection, no dignity. If we complained, we were threatened with dismissal. I endured it because I had to. But I saw women getting sick, crying, destroying themselves. Mr. Albert didn't care. Profit was all that mattered. What happened? The factory went bankrupt. You know why? Because unmotivated employees produce poorly. Because unhappy people don't care about quality. Because eventually all the good professionals left, and only those who had no choice remained. Clients noticed the drop in quality. They stopped buying, and Mr. Albert's empire crumbled. Rita leaned forward, looking intensely at James. Afterward, another factory opened in the same location. The owner, Mrs. Teresa, paid better, treated people well, listened to employees. People said she'd go bankrupt because she spent too much on workers. You know what happened? That factory prospered. It exists to this day, 40 years later, because happy people create beautiful things. Because loyalty can't be bought, it's earned. Because treating people well isn't weakness, it's intelligent long-term strategy. But the investors don't see that, James protested. Some don't, but others, the smart ones, do. And you need to decide. Do you want to build something that lasts, or something that generates quick profits and then disappears? James remained silent for a long time. Rita could see the storm of thoughts on his face. My grandmother, he began slowly, before she died, made me promise something. She said, James, you're going to be rich, I know you will. But don't let wealth kill your soul. Don't become the kind of man who tramples others to climb. Use your power to elevate, not to crush. And what kind of man have you been? Before you arrived? The kind she made me promise I'd never be. But these past months, I feel like I'm finally honoring her memory. Then you already have your answer. James stood, began pacing the office. Rita watched the internal struggle happening. It was a decision that would define not just his career, but who he was as a person. If I resist the board and they remove me, I could lose everything, James said. Or you could prove there's a better way to do business. And if they remove you for treating people well, then this isn't truly your company anyway. What if they're right? What if I'm being naive? James, look at your team. Look at their faces. Look at the joy that returned to people's eyes. Does that seem like naivety? Or does it seem like humanity finally being recognized? At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Sophie entered, unaware of the tense meeting that had just ended. Sorry to interrupt, but Juliana just closed a huge contract. The client said they chose our company because our team seemed genuinely happy and committed. Said it shows through in the quality of work. Sophie smiled. Thought you'd want to know. When Sophie left, James looked at Rita with something new in his eyes. Determination. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call a special shareholders meeting. I'm going to present all the real data, increased productivity, reduced turnover, new contracts, client satisfaction. I'm going to show that humanity and profit aren't enemies, and I'm going to give investors a choice. Either they trust my vision, or they can sell their shares. But I'm not backing down. Rita smiled, feeling immense pride. Your grandmother would be very proud. What if I lose everything? Then you lose as a man of integrity, and you rebuild knowing who you truly are. But my intuition says you won't lose. It says you're about to prove there's a better way. In the following weeks, James worked tirelessly preparing his presentation. Rita helped him, bringing real employee stories, satisfaction data, concrete evidence that the changes were working. Sophie coordinated an internal survey. The results were impressive. 92% of employees said they'd never been happier at work. 87% said they'd recommend the company to friends. And most importantly, 78% said they now felt proud to work at Walker Industries. On the day of the assembly, Rita sat in the front row. She watched James take the stage, not as the calculating CEO of before, but as a leader who had finally found his true purpose. Ladies and gentlemen investors, he began, voice firm. Today I'm going to present something that might challenge your expectations. I'm going to show that caring for people isn't the opposite of generating profits. It's the path to sustainable and true profits. For the next hour, James presented data, graphs, stories. He showed how employee satisfaction translated into product quality, how team loyalty reduced training costs, how the company's reputation was attracting the best talent in the market. I can go back to being the CEO who maximizes quarterly profits by stepping on people, James concluded. Or I can be the CEO who builds something that lasts generations. You choose. But if you choose the first, you choose without me. The silence in the room was absolute. Rita held her breath. Then Robert Mitchell, the skeptical chairman, stood. Rita braced for the worst. James, Robert began, and his voice was different now. I admit I was wrong. I was so focused on numbers that I forgot numbers are created by people. After this presentation, I not only support your continuation as CEO, but I want to implement similar principles in the other companies in our portfolio. One by one, other investors voiced their support. The transformation was complete. When it was all over, James came down from the stage straight to Rita and hugged her tight. We did it, he whispered. We proved there's a better way. You proved it, Rita corrected. I just helped you find what was always inside you. That night, James, Rita, and Sophie had dinner together at a simple restaurant, far from corporate glamour. To new beginnings, James raised his glass. And to brave grandmothers, who saved not just their granddaughters, but lost CEOs too. Rita smiled, looking at the two young people before her. One battle had been won, but the war for a more humane corporate world was just beginning. 1 year after that historic assembly, Rita was in the hospital. Nothing serious, the doctors assured her. Just a scare. A sudden dizzy spell during a meeting, followed by routine tests that revealed high blood pressure and the need for rest. But for a 69-year-old woman who'd never stopped in her entire life, the word rest sounded almost like a prison sentence. Grandma, you need to slow down, Sophie said for the 10th time that afternoon, sitting in the chair beside the hospital bed. Her face was tight with worry. You work more than anyone in that office. I'm not working, sweetheart. I'm living. Rita tried to smile, but even that tired her more than it should. There's a huge difference. James arrived minutes later holding a bouquet of simple flowers, white daisies, Rita's favorites. His face was pale, and Rita noticed he had deep circles under his eyes, probably from a sleepless night since hearing about her hospitalization. "Mrs. Morrison," his voice came out broken, "you gave me the biggest scare of my life." "Dramatic," Rita joked weakly. "Just my body's way of telling me to tap the brakes. The doctor said you need complete rest for at least 6 weeks. James pulled up a chair, sitting on the other side of the bed. "No work, no stress." Rita sighed. She looked at the 2 young people around her. Sophie at 25, flourishing in her career and life. James at 36, transformed into a leader she barely recognized as the tense man she'd met a year ago. Both looking at her with love and gratitude, but also with fear of losing her. "You know," Rita began, and her voice had a contemplative quality that made both of them stop to listen. "When I was at the doctor's office hearing about high blood pressure, exhaustion, needing to take better care of myself, I had a revelation." "What revelation, Grandma?" Sophie held her hand. "That for the first time in my life, I'm tired not from surviving, but from living intensely. And that's a privilege I never had before." James frowned. "I don't understand." Rita adjusted herself in the bed, gathering strength to explain something she'd been feeling since waking that morning. "I spent 50 years of my life just surviving. Waking before sunrise to work. Sleeping late because there was still laundry to iron, food to prepare, bills to stretch until the end of the month. Surviving is exhausting, but it's different. It's mechanical. You just do it because you have to." She paused, breathing slowly. "But this past year, I wasn't surviving. I was living with purpose. I woke up excited to see how people were doing. I went to bed satisfied, knowing I'd made a difference in someone's life. I got tired not from carrying weight, but from carrying hope. And if my body is complaining now, it's because for the first time at 69 years old, I truly lived." Sophie had tears streaming down her face. James discreetly wiped his own eyes. "But now you need to rest," Sophie insisted. "You need to take care of yourself." "I'll rest," Rita promised. "But I won't stop living. There's a difference. And that's exactly what I've been trying to teach all of you this whole time." During the 6 weeks of recovery at home, Rita had time to think, time to stare out the window, to flip through old photo albums, to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. Sophie took vacation time to stay with her, and James visited daily after work. One afternoon, while they were having tea in the small living room, James asked the question that had been stuck for weeks. "Mrs. Morrison, may I ask you something personal?" "Always." "Do you have any regrets in life?" Rita thought for a long moment, stirring sugar into her tea with slow movements. "Regret is a strong word. I miss things I couldn't do, places I couldn't see, opportunities I didn't have because I was too busy surviving, but regret? No. How can you not? You could have had such an easier life if..." "If what, James? If my husband hadn't abandoned me? If I'd been born into a wealthy family? If the world were different?" Rita shook her head gently. "I can spend the rest of my life wishing circumstances were different, or I can celebrate what I built despite them." "And what did you build?" James leaned forward. 3 strong daughters who raised their own families. A brilliant granddaughter who's changing the world in her own way. Rita looked at Sophie with deep love. Real relationships. The ability to look in the mirror and like the person I see. The certainty that I treated people with dignity, even when life didn't treat me that way. That's not nothing, James. It's everything. Sophie, who'd been washing dishes in the kitchen, stopped to listen. She approached and sat on the floor at her grandmother's feet like she did as a child. "Grandma, you never told me. How did you do it? How did you raise 3 daughters alone, work so much, and still never lose your kindness? Never become bitter?" Rita stroked her granddaughter's hair tenderly. "Who said I didn't become bitter? There were nights, many nights when I cried with rage. Rage at Marcus for abandoning us. Rage at the world for being unfair. Rage at myself for not being able to give my daughters more. How did you overcome it?" I realized something fundamental. Bitterness is poison I'd be drinking while hoping it would poison others. My ex-husband was somewhere living his life, not even thinking about me. My exploitative bosses slept peacefully in their big houses. My anger wasn't hurting any of them. It was only destroying me from the inside. James listened to every word like it was sacred scripture. So I consciously decided every day to choose differently. When I woke up angry, I'd look at my daughter's sleeping faces and choose love. When I came home exhausted wanting to scream, I'd breathe deep and choose patience. When I saw injustice, instead of becoming part of it, I chose to be the change I wanted to see. But isn't it exhausting? Choosing good every time? James asked. It's much more exhausting to carry hatred, dear. Much more. Hatred weighs tons. Love, however difficult it may be, at least lets you sleep at night. There was a contemplative silence. Sophie stood, hugging her grandmother from behind the chair. You're my hero, Grandma. You always have been. I'm not a hero, Sophie. I'm just a woman who decided that circumstances wouldn't define character. And that, my love, anyone can do. You don't need money. You don't need formal education. You just need the daily decision to be truly human. When James left that night, Rita noticed something different in him. A lightness. Like something he'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. 6 weeks later, when Rita received complete medical clearance, James asked her and Sophie to come to the company for a small celebration. Rita suspected it would be something more. When they arrived, the office was decorated with a simple banner. Welcome back, Mrs. Morrison. But what surprised her was seeing not just Walker Industries employees, but other people she didn't recognize. James took the microphone, nervous in a way Rita had never seen. Mrs. Morrison, when you walked into my office a year and a half ago, I was a successful but empty man. I had money, power, respect, but I didn't have peace. I didn't have true purpose, and I definitely didn't have real connection with the people around me. People nodded in agreement. Rita saw Juliana, Marcus, Carla, Patricia, all the employees who'd shared their truths in that transformative meeting months ago. You didn't just help me reconnect with my team, you helped me reconnect with myself, with the values my grandmother Rita tried to teach me, with the humanity I'd buried under spreadsheets and strategies. James paused, emotional. So I didn't want to do anything institutional. I didn't want to create a Morrison Foundation or something cold like that. Instead, I did something I believe you'd approve of. He gestured to the unfamiliar people in the room. These are 5 people from other companies. CEOs, managers, leaders who heard about our transformation and want to learn. But they're not going to learn from me. They're going to learn from you, if you accept, of course. Rita was confused. Learn what? How to lead with humanity. How to truly see people. How to build companies that are profitable without forgetting that profits are created by human beings with stories, pain, and dreams. James smiled. I want you to create a mentorship program, not to teach business techniques, but to teach what no business school teaches, how to be human in positions of power. One of the unfamiliar women stepped forward. She was about 50, elegant, but with tired eyes. Mrs. Morrison, I'm CEO of a marketing firm. I built my career being tough, relentless. It works financially, but I'm miserable. My team fears me. My children barely recognize me. When I heard about what you did here, I thought, there's a better way, and I want to learn. One by one, the others introduced themselves, each with their story of external success and internal emptiness, each seeking something Rita had in abundance, authentic humanity. I don't know if I can teach this, Rita said honestly. I don't have a resume. I don't have certifications. You have something much better, said Juliana, stepping forward. You have a life lived with integrity. You have wisdom gained from years of struggle and overcoming. You have the ability to truly see people. That can't be learned from books, Mrs. Morrison. That can only be learned from those who've lived it. Sophie was crying openly now, too proud to contain her tears. Grandma, you always said your only legacy was raising your daughters well and helping me grow. But look at this. Look at how many lives you're touching. How many people you're transforming. Rita looked around the room. She saw hopeful people. People tired of the old model. People wanting something more meaningful. She saw, primarily, the possibility of multiplying what she'd learned in nearly 7 decades of life. All right, she said finally, voice firm despite the emotion. But we do it my way. No formal presentations or pretty theories. We'll meet, have coffee, talk about real life. I'll share my stories, my mistakes, my lessons, and you'll share yours. Because leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to be human and vulnerable. The applause that followed was genuine and emotional. In the following months, Rita started what she simply called the conversations. Every week, a small group of leaders gathered in Walker Industries' conference room. But they didn't feel like corporate meetings. They felt like gatherings at everyone's grandmother's house. Rita brought homemade cakes, served coffee in regular cups, and simply talked about resilience, about forgiveness, about how to treat people with dignity, even when no one treated you that way, about choosing humanity every day, even when it's difficult. One afternoon, 6 months after the conversations began, James and Sophie were helping Rita clean up after a session. "You know what I noticed today?" James commented. "That marketing CEO, Laura. When she first started coming to the conversations, she had this armor, this hardness. Today she shared that she had a real conversation with her daughter for the first time in years, and she was crying with joy. Because she finally understood," Rita replied, putting away cups. "Success without human connection is a golden prison. You can have everything and still have nothing that matters." Sophie hugged her grandmother. "Grandma, do you realize you're creating a silent revolution? Every person who goes through your conversations goes back to their companies and changes how they treat people. And those people change how they treat others. It's a domino effect of humanity. It's not revolution, dear. It's just reminding people of the basics we forgot. That all of us, regardless of position or power, are just humans trying to do our best with what we have. And that treating others with dignity isn't weakness, it's strength." That night at home, Rita opened her journal, a habit she'd resumed during recovery. She wrote, "Today I turned 70, 7 decades in this world. I spent 50 years surviving, 20 years raising the next generation. And now, in these past months, I finally discovered my greater purpose, helping others rediscover their humanity. I didn't build companies. I didn't accumulate fortune. I don't have awards on the wall or public recognition, but I have something no degree can give. The peace of knowing I lived with integrity. I saw Sophie become not just a competent professional, but a compassionate person. I saw James transform from feared CEO to beloved leader. I saw Juliana recover her voice. I saw Marcus celebrate fatherhood without fear. I saw Laura reconnect with her daughter. This is legacy. Not buildings with my name. Not bank accounts. But lives touched. People transformed. Humanity restored. If I die tomorrow, I go in peace. Because I lived. I truly lived." 1 week later, Rita was at the conversations when one of the participants, a 32-year-old CEO named Raphael, asked a question that would change the tone of the entire gathering. "Mrs. Morrison, are you afraid of dying?" The room fell silent. It was the question everyone thought, but no one had the courage to ask. Rita didn't hesitate. "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not having lived enough." "But you're 70 years old. Isn't that living enough?" "Living enough isn't about quantity of time. It's about quality of presence. I know 30-year-olds who are already dead inside, and I've known 90-year-olds who are more alive than any young person." Rita looked at each face in the room. "The question isn't how much time we have. It's what we do with the time we have." Laura, the marketing CEO, wiped away tears. "How do you want to be remembered?" "As someone who saw people, who truly saw. Not their positions, not their utilities, not their mistakes, but their hearts, their struggles, their humanity." Rita smiled. "And as someone who proved it's never too late to find purpose." That at 68, when many think life is over, I was just beginning to truly live. James, who was sitting in the back just observing, felt something break inside him. He stood and walked to Rita, kneeling beside her chair. "Mrs. Morrison, when my grandmother died, I thought I'd never again have someone who truly saw me, who loved me not for what I do, but for who I am." His voice was broken. "But then you came into my life, and you gave me not just a second grandmother. You gave me a second chance to be human." Rita placed her hand on his face, like she would with a blood grandson. "And you gave me purpose when I thought my useful life was over. We proved together that transformation is possible at any age, that it's never too late to make a difference. And that true legacy isn't measured in money, but in lives touched." When the conversations ended that day, no one wanted to leave. People stayed talking, hugging, sharing. Something profound had happened. A community had formed, not of business, of humans. Sophie, observing everything, thought about how a year and a half ago her life was about to crumble because of a twisted ankle, and how an act of courage from her grandmother had transformed not just her life, but hundreds of people's lives. "Grandma," she said as they headed home, "do you realize your story will be told for generations? That every person you touched will tell others? That your legacy will live far beyond you?" Rita looked out the car window, watching the illuminated city pass by. She thought about all the people in those lights, each one with their struggles, their pains, their dreams. "My legacy isn't my story, Sophie. It's what each person does with the lessons I shared. It's James leading with heart. It's you, mentoring with empathy. It's Juliana having courage to use her voice. It's Laura reconnecting with her daughter. The legacy isn't about me. It's about what continues after I'm gone." "But you'll be with us for a long time still," Sophie said, voice firm. "I'll be here as long as I can, and I'll live each day like it matters, because it does. Every conversation matters. Every smile matters. Every moment of genuine humanity matters." That night, before sleeping, Rita looked at the family photo on her nightstand. Her 3 daughters, her grandchildren, the life she'd built with so much struggle, and she realized something profound. She was rich, not in money, but in love, in purpose, in meaning. Rich in real relationships, rich in knowing she'd made a difference. That, she thought, is what truly matters in the end. Not what we accumulate, but what we give. Not how long we live, but how we live. Not our successes, but our humanity. And with that thought, Rita slept in peace. A peace that all the money in the world couldn't buy, because she'd discovered the secret many spend their whole lives searching for. True legacy isn't in what we leave behind. It's in who we become, and in how we help others become the best version of themselves. And that, more than any award or recognition, was enough. It was everything.